November 1944, a battalion command post near Dieuze, in the mud-soaked region of Lorraine, France. Rain falls in a steady, freezing drizzle that turns the foxholes into open graves. Inside a dim stone farmhouse, a battalion commander sits behind a heavy oak desk, methodically scratching lines through a stack of paper. He is removing the names of the very men who saved his life and the lives of 200 others only 48 hours ago. Outside, 3 soldiers stand in the cold, waiting for a recognition they were promised but will never see. They do not know that their heroism is currently being erased by a fountain pen. They do not know that in the eyes of their commander, their courage is a clerical error, but George Patton is about to discover that some ink is meant to be permanent, and he will ensure the man who tried to hide the truth is the one forced to shout it to the world. This is the story of what happened when a commander attempted to erase the history of the very men who saved his life. It is the account of a general who refused to let prejudice dictate the worth of a soldier under fire. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when prejudice met consequences. Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole was 29 years old. He came from the industrial heart of Detroit, Michigan, a man who had traded the assembly lines of the Motor City for the mud of the French frontier. He served with a conviction that was often tested but never broken. Before the war, he had been a man of quiet ambitions, working to support a younger sister and a widowed mother, hoping to one day own a small plot of land far from the soot of the factories. He had seen the worst of the Lorraine campaign, watching friends vanish into the tree lines of the Forêt de Paroy. He carried the weight of leadership on his shoulders, a burden made heavier by the knowledge that his men were fighting 2 wars at once, one against the German army, and one against the very institution they served. 2 days prior, he had watched an ambush tear into a white platoon. Without waiting for an order that might never come, he led a 3-man counterattack through a hail of lead. He personally neutralized 2 machine gun nests and dragged a wounded officer through a drainage ditch while mortars chewed the earth around him. He did it not for a medal, but because it was the only way to keep his squad alive. Lieutenant Colonel Warren Gatlin was 44 years old. He hailed from Atlanta, Georgia, and was a career infantry officer who viewed the military through the lens of a rigid, ancestral hierarchy. He was an efficient commander, the kind of man whose logistics were always precise and whose boots were always polished to a mirror shine. On his footlocker sat a framed photograph of his father in Confederate gray, a relic he referred to as a sacred family tradition. Gatlin believed in a world of order where every man had a specific, immovable place. To him, black soldiers were useful for hauling crates and driving trucks, but he was fundamentally incapable of acknowledging them as combat equals. He believed that if Washington saw reports of black soldiers outperforming white platoons, it would threaten the very foundation of the army he loved. He did not see men like Marcus Cole as heroes. He saw them as a statistical inconvenience that needed to be managed. While Cole washed the blood of a rescued lieutenant off his hands, Gatlin sat in the warmth of his command post, preparing to sign a report that would bury the names of the 3 men who had just saved his company from total annihilation. By November 1944, the Allied momentum that had carried the liberators across France began to grind against the jagged reality of the Lorraine campaign. The weather had turned into a weapon of its own, the Saar River was rising, and the mud of the French basin had become a thick, gelatinous glue that swallowed tanks and rotted the feet of the infantry. This was a war of attrition, fought for small, nameless hills and flooded villages like Dieuze. The German army, though retreating, was far from broken. They utilized the dense forests and ancient stone architecture to create kill zones, waiting for the Americans to stumble into carefully prepared ambushes. In this environment, every man was expected to be a rifleman first and a specialist second. The lines were blurred, and the traditional rear echelon roles were being discarded out of sheer necessity. However, the United States Army was an institution of deep contradictions. It was fighting a global crusade for liberation while remaining one of the most strictly segregated organizations on the planet. Regulations dictated that black soldiers be kept in separate units, often relegated to trucking or graves registration. Many white commanders viewed these men not as fellow soldiers, but as a labor force that lacked the temperament for the front lines. This prejudice often led to a deliberate blindness. When black units performed with distinction, their achievements were frequently minimized, misattributed, or buried under the weight of official paperwork. Officers like Gatlin weren't just following the rules of the day. They were actively protecting a social order they felt was more important than the tactical truth of the battlefield. They preferred a comfortable lie over a heroic reality that challenged their worldview. This systemic erasure was occurring in command posts all across the European theater. But in this specific battalion, the silence was about to be broken by a voice that could not be ignored. Captain Thomas Vance, 26, from Columbus, Ohio, stepped into the battalion command post and dropped a set of handwritten papers onto Gatlin's desk. He was the executive officer of the company that had been pinned down in the Dieuze woods, and he had spent the morning interviewing the men who had made it out alive. He looked at the colonel and told him that the official after-action report was missing the most important part of the engagement. He stated that the rescue wasn't carried out by unnamed elements, but by 3 specific men from the quartermaster squad who took up rifles and saved 100 lives. Gatlin didn't look up from his ledger. He told Vance that the report was already finalized and filed. Vance didn't back down. He said that Sergeant Cole, Private Harris, and Private Banks deserved silver stars for what they did out there. Gatlin finally looked up, his face set in a hard, patronizing mask. He asked the captain why he was so intent on disrupting the official record for the sake of a few Negroes who were just doing what they were told. Vance replied that they weren't told to do anything. They saw white soldiers dying, and they charged a machine gun nest of their own volition. Gatlin leaned back and told him that Washington doesn't want to hear stories about colored boys outperforming white infantry platoons. He said it would cause a mess in the press and stir up trouble back home that the Army didn't need. He told Vance that in his battalion, things stayed in their proper place. Vance asked if the lives of his men were less important than the colonel's social theories. Gatlin's voice turned cold. He told the captain to remember his rank and to stop acting like a sentimentalist. He said the report would stand as written because the battalion's reputation was his responsibility, and he wouldn't have it tarnished by suggesting his best fighters were truck drivers. Vance stared at him for a long moment, then picked up his copies of the eyewitness statements. He told the colonel that if the battalion commander wouldn't recognize courage, perhaps the 3rd Army commander would. Gatlin laughed and told him he was welcome to try, confident that no general had time for a captain's complaints about a few missing names in a minor skirmish report. The report reached Patton's headquarters within the hour. The general arrived within the hour. His jeep splashed through the freezing slush, a low-slung Predator cutting through the gray morning. 4 stars gleamed on his helmet, and the ivory grips of his revolvers caught the dim light. He walked into the battalion command post unannounced, the heavy thud of his boots silencing the room. The air grew heavy. Patton did not look at the maps or the radios. He walked straight to the desk where Gatlin stood at rigid attention. He placed 2 pieces of paper side by side on the scarred wood. One was the official report Gatlin had signed. The other was the statement from the rescued lieutenant. Patton looked at Gatlin, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. He asked the colonel to explain why his official report mentioned unnamed elements. While the lieutenant's report named 3 men, Gatlin stammered that the situation was chaotic. Patton asked if the chaos made the colonel blind or merely illiterate. Gatlin looked away and said he felt it was better for the unit's morale to focus on the collective effort. Patton asked if ignoring the men who saved his life was the colonel's idea of a morale booster. Gatlin finally muttered that he didn't want Washington asking why his white troops needed saving by truck drivers. Patton stood motionless, his eyes like flint. He told Gatlin that there was no such thing as a truck driver or a rifleman when the lead was flying, only soldiers who did their duty and cowards who didn't. He said that Gatlin had tried to commit a theft more shameful than stealing supplies. He had tried to steal a man's honor. Patton reminded him that every drop of blood spilled on that field was the same color, regardless of the man's skin or the city he called home. He pointed at the 3 names, Cole, Harris, and Banks. He said these men had faced the German army and won, yet they had met a more treacherous enemy inside their own command post. Patton stated that in the 3rd Army, a man's worth was measured by the ground he took and the lives he saved, not by the prejudices of a commander who was more concerned with his social standing in Atlanta than the truth in France. He told Gatlin that he had attempted to erase the history of heroes to protect the feelings of failures. He gave the colonel a single, terrifying choice. He could sit there and watch Patton sign the recommendations himself, or he could spend the rest of the war in a labor camp, shoveling the very mud he thought he was too good for. Gatlin remained silent, his face pale as ash. Patton sat in Gatlin's chair, took up a pen, and began to write. Patton stood and ordered the sergeant of the guard to assemble every man in the battalion immediately. The heavy rain continued to fall as the soldiers formed into tight, shivering ranks in the mud outside the command post. They stood in a hollow square, a sea of olive drab and steel helmets. Patton walked into the center of the formation, his coat glistening with water. Gatlin followed behind him, his face a mask of humiliation. He looked at the mud, at the boots of the men he had tried to ignore. Patton called Cole, Harris, and Banks forward. The three men marched into the center of the square, their movements sharp and disciplined despite the cold. Patton handed the typed citations to Gatlin and told him to read them. Gatlin's voice was thin and brittle as he read the accounts of their bravery aloud to the entire battalion. When he finished, Patton ordered Gatlin to pin the medals on their chests. The colonel's hands shook as he fumbled with the metal clasps against the wet fabric of their jackets. He had to look each man in the eye. He had to touch the shoulders of the men he had tried to make invisible. The battalion watched in absolute silence. They smelled the wet wool and the churned earth. They saw their commander forced to honor the very men he had betrayed. When the last medal was pinned, Patton leaned in close to Gatlin. He told the colonel that he had erased the men who saved his company, and now every man in the battalion had watched him restore them. He told Gatlin to pack his gear. A jeep was waiting to take him to a personnel office in the rear, where he would never command a combat soldier again. Marcus Cole returned to Detroit in 1946. He walked back into the city not as a truck driver, but as a man who had seen the absolute best and worst of the human heart. He used the GI Bill to study engineering and eventually became a foreman at a major automotive plant, a leader of men in peace just as he had been in war. He was a pillar of his church and his neighborhood, though he rarely spoke of the medals in the velvet box in his drawer. He died in 1991, surrounded by grandchildren who only learned the full extent of his bravery when his old unit records were declassified and celebrated decades after the fact. He lived a life of quiet dignity, never allowing the bitterness of that rainy day in France to corrode the man he chose to be. Warren Gatlin's descent was as swift as his removal from command. He spent the remainder of the war in a cramped office in Le Havre, processing payroll and supply requisitions under the watchful eye of officers who knew exactly why he had been reassigned. He was discharged in 1947 and returned to Georgia, where he attempted to enter local politics. However, the shadow of his relief followed him. He became a recluse, spending his final years writing letters to military journals, complaining about the decline of discipline and the blurring of traditional lines. He died in 1974, a man out of time and out of favor. Patton never mentioned Gatlin by name in his memoirs, but a single entry in his private diary from late 1944 noted that he had encountered a commander who tried to fight the census instead of the Germans. Patton wrote that he had fixed the error, noting that a man who cannot recognize a hero has no business leading them. He believed the truth of the battlefield was the only truth that mattered. Some historians argue that Patton was motivated more by tactical discipline and the pragmatism of war than by a modern sense of social justice. They suggest his intervention was a calculated move to ensure that every available asset was utilized to its maximum potential during a critical shortage of infantry. Others argue that his actions reflected a genuine, if blunt, commitment to a meritocracy where the only thing that mattered was a soldier's performance under fire. They point to his willingness to publicly humiliate a high-ranking officer as proof that he placed the integrity of the Army above the comfort of its traditions. What is certain is that Patton's refusal to allow the erasure of these men created a historical record that would have otherwise vanished into the mud of Lorraine. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have simply filed the correct report and moved on quietly? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when prejudice met consequences, Make sure to subscribe.